Disney is one of the most recognizable companies in the world and has been for over 100 years now. And a big part of what makes it so successful is its strong library of characters. And the thing with Disney characters is that they're pretty timeless, all things considered. Characters like Mickey Mouse, Cinderella, and Elsa are all incredibly relevant and popular today, despite all debuting decades apart from each other. Disney has recognized how popular these characters are, and a more recent development has been creating brands for its characters. Obviously, you have the franchises that are based off of its films, which include sequels, video games, sometimes TV spin-offs, but Disney also sometimes groups together specific characters in their pantheon and creates a brand surrounding them. Of course, the most famous of these is the Disney princesses, and you have the Disney villains, which are incredibly popular as well. These brands have been very lucrative for the company, and each kind of targets a specific type of demographic. And with the successes of these brands, Disney decided to branch out and find even more brands it could create, each sort of having its own target demographic. One prospective franchise came from a pretty curious place. Its first animated feature, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Now, this franchise wouldn't center around Snow White herself, as she was tied up with the princesses, but rather her 7 companions: Doc, Dopey, Grumpy, Sleepy, Sneezy, Happy, and Bashful. Disney Dwarfs, while maybe a questionable name, was envisioned to be a franchise that could stand toe-to-toe with its biggest brands, a new pillar in the company's portfolio, and Disney certainly had high hopes for this franchise. They not only planned what was said to be an incredibly ambitious film series, but an equally ambitious, if not more so, video game tie-in. The Disney direct-to-video film releases were incredibly controversial and not exactly critically acclaimed, but this film was said to be not only the most ambitious, but also simply the best. Unfortunately, the direct-to-video experiment would come crashing down, and with it, the franchise that could have changed Disney. But how did we get here? Well, strap in, it's going to be a journey.
Part 1, Disneytoon.
Not only did it see a major resurgence in the success of its animated films and huge expansion of its theme park offerings, executives also sought ways to improve upon its iconic slate of films. The home video market was absolutely booming in the 90s due to the accessibility of VHS players. Disney saw this and knew that it wanted to cash in on it. I'm sure many children of the 90s and 2000s are familiar with these direct-to-video sequels. Most of these films, with some exceptions, were made by Disneytoon Studios. Now, the history of this studio is its own sordid story, but for some quick history, its first feature film was based off of the DuckTales TV series.
Bless me bagpipes!
It's a genie!
That will lead to unbelievable magic.
I wish for the treasure of Koli Baba.
Notably, this was a theatrical release. However, DuckTales Treasure of the Lost Lamp was not a box office success, and so the studio decided to shift their strategy a bit. At the time, Disney was also experiencing a bit of a television renaissance with the success of its Disney Afternoon block, and potential TV spin-offs of their theatrical films were being considered as a way to volley off those successes. Aladdin was considered to be a prime candidate, and so development began. A common trend for the Disney Afternoon shows was to start them off with a bang. A multi-episode arc anywhere between 3 and 5 episodes, sometimes broadcast in prime time. Aladdin was going to be no exception, and they really wanted to go in guns blazing. A story involving the return of Jafar, the villain from the original film. But then a decision was made, as a bit of an experiment. The Return of Jafar was still going to be the pilot for the TV series, but instead of being released on television, it was going to be packaged as a legit film, and released, gasp, to home video. Naturally, this was met with a lot of resistance from Disney, who felt that this had the potential to cheapen the Disney brand. This was similar to releasing the animated features themselves on video, which even into the 90s Disney was resistant to, but Disney relented and The Return of Jafar was released on home video and became an immediate success, making over $300 million and is still one of the best-selling VHS releases of all time. And the rest, of course, is history. Disney and Disneytoon specifically were committed to direct-to-video releases, mostly sequels to its animated films, but sometimes prequels and even some midquels. But there was another massive change happening within Disney, one that would directly affect Disneytoon Studios and the company altogether.
Part 2, Brands.
I feel like the story of the Disney princesses is pretty well known at this point, but here's a brief overview. Then head of Disney Consumer Products, Andy Mooney, was at a Disney on Ice event with his daughters when he noticed a lot of little girls were dressed as princesses. But these dresses weren't released by Disney, but rather generic costume dresses. But this sparked an idea. Disney could sell their own princess dresses. But not only dresses, they could make an entire merchandise line around them. Prior to this, Disney simply sold the merch under the specific film it was tied to. This often coincided with films that were either being released or re-released, So if the film wasn't being heavily promoted by Disney, you often didn't see much merch of it on store shelves. But this was by design, as each film was its own world, and the company didn't want intermingling between them. But with this radical new idea, Disney would group together some of its most iconic and popular characters into one coalition, and this new grouping would be the basis of its own dedicated merch. This was also met with some resistance, notably from Walt Disney's nephew Roy, who was heavily involved with the company at the time. Roy's fears were that having these separate characters mingled together would collectively weaken their individual films. So a compromise was made. While the characters would be grouped together, they wouldn't actually acknowledge each other. That's why in all the stock group photos of the line, none of them are actually looking at each other, so they could all conceivably still exist within their own universes. That's also why they're never depicted in a specific place. Often, they're just in front of some nebulous pink void or sometimes a generic castle background. Now, this has been relaxed considerably in recent years, most notably with Wreck-It Ralph 2 and some merchandise. And I think anyone would agree that it just makes sense to have them interact. So the Disney Princess line launched in 2000 with the characters Snow White, Cinderella, Aurora, Ariel, Belle, Jasmine, Pocahontas, Esmeralda, Mulan, and Tinkerbell. This lineup has seen some changes over the years with the removal of Esmeralda and Tinkerbell, who was going to her own franchise, and the addition of characters from films that came after the franchise's creation: Tiana, Rapunzel, Merida, Moana, and Raya. And the Disney Princess experiment was a massive success, making over $1 billion in its first year and absolutely exploding from there. You've got princess dresses, dolls, character meet and greets. Despite some bad faith criticism over the years, the Disney Princess brand was and still is a genuine phenomenon. And Disney noticed. And they wondered, what if they could replicate this formula, bring together a group of characters, sometimes even disparate ones, and brand them? And so in the 2000s, we saw this strategy many more times to varying levels of success. Perhaps the most prominent of these is the Disney Villains, which, as I'm sure you can guess, gathers some of Disney's most popular villainous characters. But did you know that there are many other attempts to recapture that lightning in the bottle success of the Disney princesses? Let's go over a few attempts, shall we? Disney Bunnies, a franchise starring Thumper from Bambi and his family. It mostly consisted of simple picture books. Disney Dragonkind, or Dragonkind, I don't know. But it starred famous dragons from Disney films, reimagined and redesigned to sell as collector statues. Characters like Mushu, Maleficent, and Elliot were all part of this. Disney Adventurers was basically designed to be the boy counterpart to the princesses, starring some of Disney's most popular male characters. It starred Peter Pan, Aladdin, Hercules, and Tarzan. And notice how I said characters and not heroes? Yeah, Captain Hook was also part of this brand for some reason. This franchise mostly consisted of action figures and toy cars. You know, things boys like. This franchise also went through a bit of a revamp and was renamed Disney Heroes, and the characters were attempted to be redesigned to be more battle ready. This was a late stage discovery, so maybe there's a deeper story here. I don't know. So the thing with these franchises is they all hit a different niche. Like, the princesses mainly target young girls, and the villains mainly target adults and like Hot Topic teens. The Bunnies line was geared towards children under 8. The Adventurers line was geared towards young boys, and the Dragonkind was geared towards, I don't know, adult men who collect statues. Probably the most notable of these attempts was the Disney Fairies line, but even that never reached the heights of the princesses. I do find the fairies interesting because besides Tinkerbell, who was of course the lead character, all the other characters were original to the franchise. But it did follow the same general idea as the princess line, characters with their own unique color scheme, personality, and talent. And we are going to reference the fairies line quite a bit in this video because the history of that line is intrinsically linked with the line we're talking about here. But as the fairies line was being developed, Disney decided that they wanted to create a similar franchise, one that targeted the same age range, but boys instead of girls. For context, the fairies line had a slight overlap with the princess demographic, but generally skewed younger. And so this was kind of envisioned as a similar type of situation. Disney thought, what franchise do we have that has an established group of characters that could appeal to boys? And they looked to the very first film in the studio's storied history.
Part 3, Snow White.
I don't really feel like I need to underscore the importance of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs for Disney. Walt always liked the original Snow White story and thought it would be the perfect basis for his most ambitious idea up to that point, an animated feature film, which basically hadn't been done before. Walt essentially risked his own career to make the film in the middle of the Great Depression. Many critics were highly skeptical, but Walt ended up proving them wrong. Snow White became a major critical and commercial success and basically created the animated film industry as we know it. So with that, there always is this reverence towards Snow White, and while all the animated films from the Walt Disney era are given a special pedestal by many Disney fans and even the company itself, this is the original film. And so when it came to the new phenomenon of direct-to-video sequels, there was some trepidation with the idea of making a sequel to one of these Walt-era films. In fact, it took over 10 years to get a proper sequel to a Walt-era film, Return to Neverland, which wasn't even a direct-to-video release. But Cinderella 2 released like a week later.
Discover what comes after Happily Ever After, as Walt Disney's most enchanting fairy tale continues. Cinderella 2, Dreams Come True.
The exception was Winnie the Pooh, but even then, that's kind of its own unique case as it wasn't created by Walt. However, Walt Disney himself did actually entertain the idea of making a sequel to Snow White, though not necessarily as a full-length film. But he also had an active aversion to the idea for a pretty surprising reason. After the major success of the Silly Symphony short, The Three Little Pigs, Walt and his team began work on a number of sequels to that short. However, none of these were even remotely as successful as the original, and this sort of burned Walt on the idea of making sequels to his projects. But because of the huge popularity of Snow White, there was a consistent demand for a Snow White sequel. And so Walt relented, and he did begin the process of developing a Snow White sequel in the form of a short film titled Snow White Returns. Now, based on the information we have, this wasn't going to be anything groundbreaking, just a short showcasing the dwarfs getting their cottage ready for a visit from Snow White. The big thing with this short was that it was going to reuse a lot of cut material from the original film, most notably a song entitled Music in Your Soup. The short was eventually canceled, however, and went unreleased until the 2009 Diamond Edition release of Snow White. But even then, it's not like the short was fully recreated. It just consisted of recovered material from the archives and a narration by Disney legend Don Hahn. And after that, the studio decided that they didn't really want to touch Snow White for a while. And to this day, no sequel has been made. But what if they made a prequel?
Part 4, The Prequel.
So yeah, the Seven Dwarfs were determined to be a prime candidate for a new Disney franchise. It makes sense. There are 7 distinct characters with their own distinct personalities. I mean, their personalities are literally their names. Plus, Snow White itself wasn't really marketed as a franchise in the way other films like The Little Mermaid or The Lion King were. It was mostly reserved to Snow White being a part of the greater princess brand. And the dwarfs were very popular characters, especially in the 2000s, I feel. And I hate to say it, but there's nothing stopping Disney from adding new characters to the brand either. This is Punchy. Don't let him near your fine china. Here's Snowy. Has your little boy ever wanted to like Elsa but can't because she's a girl? Well, this one's for you. And of course, we can't forget about Stealthy. He may end up in the underworld, but if you need someone to break you out of an evil castle, this is your guy. But anyways, with this new franchise in development, it was decided to make a film both to set up and promote this new franchise. And who better to make it than our old friends at DisneyToon Studios? Around this time, DisneyToon went through a bit of a strategy shift. The studio partnered with Disney Consumer Products as their official film partner, creating films designed to promote the various brands within the company. So that's why we have that awful Disney Princess Follow Your Dreams film.
Pigs, please.
As well as the Tinkerbell film series, which, remember, will be referenced throughout this video. This also coincided with a bit of a trend that saw a lot less sequels being made. And yes, that is thanks to this man to a degree, but what we saw from the studio was more original films based off of Disney IP. So instead of making like sequels and prequels, the studio started making spin-off films set within these universes, which I actually kinda like. It allows the studio to cash in on the name recognition, but without actually touching these beloved films themselves. Plus, I always like the idea of using a pre-established world as a sort of canvas and using it to tell your own new story. So we have a burgeoning franchise for Disney, and they're betting big on it. They didn't just want to start it off with some silly things like picture books or statues. They wanted a full-on film. This wasn't going to just be a little adventure starring the Seven Dwarfs, however. but it was going to be an origin story. Explained answers the questions like how they all met and why 7 grown men lived together in the woods, because I'm sure you all had those questions as well. And the results of this were a film that was surprisingly ambitious and a bit dark for a Disney film, a direct-to-video one at that. So development on this movie began in 2005, which, considering the Tinkerbell film released in 2008, it's quite obvious these were being worked on simultaneously. Like Tinkerbell, this film was to be a 3D animated film. And also like Tinkerbell, this film had a very troubled development from the beginning. I do not have time to get into the Tinkerbell production history, but all you really need to know is that the Tinkerbell film we got was not the film that was originally envisioned. At all. And when our film started development, all the studio really wanted to make was an origin story for the Seven Dwarfs. 2 brothers, Paul and Gaetan Brizzi, apologies if I pronounced that wrong, were working on an initial draft of the film. The Brizzi brothers worked on the Firebird Suite section of Fantasia 2000, and their pitch for the Seven Dwarfs did include elements that ended up factoring into later versions, namely the origins of the Evil Queen's magic mirror. But of course, this version of the film wouldn't happen. I mean, no version of the film would happen, but you know what I mean. Now, at this point in the story, we have a man named Mike Disa. Disa started working for Walt Disney Feature Animation with Pocahontas and continued through the mid-2000s. His first directing credit for Disney was a short film entitled The Origin of Stitch, which was naturally a prequel to Lilo and Stitch. This was packaged with the release of Lilo and Stitch 2, Stitch Has a Glitch, another Disneytoon production, so he was on the studio's radar. Disa was actually working on the Tinkerbell film at the time when he was suggested for the Seven Dwarfs by Sharon Morrill. Morrill was the president of Disneytoon at the time, and due to many factors, including the troubled production of Tinkerbell, she was eventually removed from that position. She also clashed with a certain individual who I alluded to earlier in this video. I wonder who that could be. Anyways, Disa was tasked with coming up with his own pitch for the Dwarfs film, and Disa had major ambitions for it. At one point, he envisioned a story that spanned thousands of years, and one of his biggest pieces of inspiration was The Lord of the Rings. Which, I appreciate the ambition at least. Even before any concrete plans for the film was made, there was a sense that this could be a turning point for Disneytoon. The studio had a reputation for making cheap cash-in sequels to films that were generally considered to be masterpieces. But this could be the chance for the studio to really prove itself, making products potentially on par with the output from the feature animation division. And the team was having fun with the project. They wanted to almost use this film as a way to shatter expectations over what a Disney film could be. While the first act of the film would be pretty standard Disney fare, audiences would find a major twist in the second half of the film, turning everything on its head. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's really dig into the story, shall we?
Part 5. The story.
Alright, so let's get into the story as Mike Disa envisioned it. While I don't think it was ever explicitly confirmed, it does seem as though the main characters of the film were going to be Grumpy and Dopey, which makes sense, obviously. Even though Doc is the leader of the 7, Grumpy and Dopey were clearly the breakout stars, with most merch featuring those 2. Dopey is the most visually distinct and is just cute, while Grumpy strongly appeals to middle-aged men. So Grumpy and Dopey meet up early in the movie, and this is actually shown in a leaked animatic from the film.
Why, it is a dwarf.
And while I'm here, I may as well talk about the only other leaked content from the film.
Sorry, you're not wrecking my big comeback. I'll get you to talk.
I assume it's not part of the film itself, but rather a self-aware teaser starring Dopey and Grumpy. The gist of it is that Grumpy is trying to get Dopey to talk and read lines from a script because they're going to be starring in a movie. And I want you to hold on to this specific sentiment for a little bit later. The only other notable thing from this clip is that this is the only real look we have at what the final film probably would have looked like, and it's pretty clear that the film was going to have a very similar art style to the Tinkerbell movies. But basically, Grumpy and Dopey live in this dwarf village and are sent on a major quest. We don't know what exactly the quest was going to be, except for the fact that they needed to stop an evil wizard. And along the way, they end up meeting and teaming up with the other 5 dwarfs, each having their own reasons for joining the group. They also join forces with a young woman named Narcissa, who was envisioned as this film's stand-in for Snow White. But unlike Snow White, you get the sense that Narcissa has some darkness within her. I mean, her name's literally Narcissa, so there's already a red flag there. So our plucky group makes it to an ancient home for the dwarfs, which I think is called something like Dwarfenholm. And this is where we get the film's big twist. our heroes have been tricked, as Narcissa is revealed to be the evil wizard's daughter, gasp, and they've been using the dwarfs for their own needs the entire time, because Dwarfenholm is home to, like, ancient magic or something. But after this, Narcissa betrays her father, trapping him in a cursed mirror. Ding. The dwarves don't give up, however, and fight back, with Dobie heroically sacrificing himself to save his new friends. And then he survives, obviously. Unfortunately, they fail to stop Narcissa, who takes over the kingdom and begins her reign as the evil queen. Ding. But what if the former rulers of the land? Well, the queen throws the now deposed king into the dungeon, where he spends the rest of his days, and ultimately passes, though his remains can still be found in the dungeon. As a skeleton. Ding. And with that, the dwarfs are forced to go into hiding, both to protect themselves and their loved ones. And that's the film. I mean, what a downer, right? I actually want to talk about that in a bit. This film was not only envisioned as an origin story for the dwarfs themselves, explaining how they all met and ended up together, but also things such as how the evil queen, who's clearly evil, came into power, what's up with the magic mirror, and most pressingly, what is the deal with the skeleton in the dungeon? So I do have my issues with the story as we know it, but I do want to say I appreciate just how ambitious this pitch was, both as a prequel and as a Disney direct-to-video release. With those, you sometimes fall into a feeling of repetition, often with the original stories being remixed or rehashed in ways that just make them feel overly familiar. It's like the Little Mermaid sequel being about Ariel's human daughter becoming a mermaid, the Beauty and the Beast Christmas movie being about Belle and Beast learning to come together despite their differences, and Bambi 2 being about Bambi growing up in the forest. But with this, you really get the sense that the team wanted to do something greater, something that could on paper be comparable to a theatrical release, or at least something that could stand on its own independent from the original film just as a quality product. Now, like I've said, this film was a bit of a contemporary to the scrap Tinkerbell film, often referred to as Tinkerbell and the Ring of Belief. And something I noticed is that these films wanted to take big swings. They both try to expand their respective worlds in really meaningful ways, and they both got pretty dark at certain points. Like, not to derail, but at one point in the story, Tinkerbell's friends sacrifice themselves so she can continue on her mission, but she's left all alone. Obviously, they're revived at the end. And, like, I think dark ideas like this are good in theory, but I do want to go into my issues with this pitch.
Part 6, my issues with the pitch.
To start, once again, I do appreciate the big swings taken with this idea, especially with a company as protective of its IP as Disney is. I also appreciate the efforts to create what is essentially an original story from the ground up, set within an established world. And believe me, this is by no means me saying I think I could make a better film. My IMDb credits amount to 0. But I do feel like I have a pretty good grasp at understanding kids' media and what kids would respond to. And this pitch leaves me with some hesitations. First off, like I mentioned, this story is dark. And I mean that both as a compliment and not as a compliment. Let us remember that this is a film targeted towards children in theory. But just as a preface, I think just because something is targeted to children doesn't mean it can't be enjoyed by adults as well. Because Disney especially makes films that are able to be enjoyed by all audiences. And I also believe that media with dark imagery can appeal to children as well. Take a look at the original Snow White, for example. And a lot of children's media nowadays, especially on television, does have a lot more mature storytelling. But I do believe that a film with this much of a downer ending may not necessarily be the right approach. Let's go over this for a second. The dwarfs don't win at the end. Dobie almost dies, and they have to spend the rest of their days in hiding, and the king is implied to starve to death in the dungeon. Kids, especially at a younger age, may not understand that this is part of a bigger story, and if they watch literally another film, the characters will be shown as happy and bubbly, and that may turn them off from it. Plus, I hate to be this person, but honestly, based off of the vibe that we see from the original film, you would have never guessed that they went through all this trauma. In fairness, we don't know the length of time between this film and the original, so maybe they've made peace with their new reality, but I don't think they would be quite as happy-go-lucky all the time even then. Not even acknowledging their previous lives. And obviously the reason for all that is because this is a prequel made to a film made decades earlier. Granted, this film was intended to be intermixed with just as much humor, and greater plan for the franchise involved lighter material to a degree, but we have to look at just this film only, since that's the only one that actually came close to completion. Plus we get to the other issues, which I lovingly refer to as the prequel problem. You know, things like explaining why Emperor Palpatine looks like this in the original Star Wars trilogy while looking like this in the prequel trilogy. It's basically falling into the trap of over-explaining things that didn't really need to be explained, or answering questions that no one really had. Take the magic mirror, for example. Why does it really matter that we know the origin of it? How does the knowledge of whose spirit inhabits the mirror enhance the original film? Why can't it simply be an enchanted object that fell into the clutches of the evil queen? It is a fantasy world with literal magic in it. I don't think a magic mirror is that hard of a concept to grasp. Though if I may, I do have a fun fact. Disney has made a series of novels that are essentially origin stories for its villains, and the evil queen's one involves the magic mirror slowly corrupting her. And guess who inhabits the mirror? Why yes, it's her father. So I guess that's just a common idea. But other questions the film sought to answer include, why do the Seven Dwarfs live together in a cabin in the woods? I mean, it's a fairy tale. Do we really need much explanation on that? People live in the woods all the time in these things. I just always assumed they were like brothers, or maybe part of working in the mine included provided housing. Why do the dwarfs seemingly know who the evil queen is? I mean, she's the queen. I'd assume most people in the kingdom and those around it would know who she is. And most importantly to me, who is the skeleton in the dungeon? And to my delight, the answer was going to be Snow White's dad. Of course, I do need to make clear that all of these judgments are based on a pitch for an unfinished film that we will never see in its entirety. But I don't know if this will really hit with its intended audience. But would you believe me if I said that this wasn't even going to be the darkest that this franchise could get?
Part 7, the video game.
Obviously, like I said, this was going to be a franchise, so it wasn't just going to be a singular film. And as we established, the franchise seemed to take a bit of a darker tone. And this was going to be taken to an even more extreme level with the tie-in video game. Honestly, this part was the most shocking revelation to me. Now, Disney isn't really known as a video game company despite releasing many video games over its existence. But a few years after these initial events, Disney really did try to be in its video game bag, with the results being mostly not great, but they really tried. There was an attempt at its own original IP, Spectrobes, and then they decided to make serious video games based on its existing IP, like the really bad Tron Evolution, the incredibly disappointing Epic Mickey, and the unfortunately axed Pirates of the Caribbean Armada of the Damned. I lament your loss every day. So yeah, Disney wanted to make an action RPG based on the Seven Dwarfs, and the company reached out to an outside developer to see their vision, and that developer was Obsidian Entertainment. Yes, that Obsidian, developer of games such as Fallout New Vegas, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2, and South Park The Stick of Truth. A pretty natural fit for the vision, I would say. For reference, this was being developed for the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, so this was going to be a serious video game. And as far as I can tell based on my research, there isn't any leaked footage of this game from any stage in development. Though we do know it was referred to as Project New Jersey and was going to be made in the Unreal Engine 3. But because of the strange circumstances of this game, there is some conflicting information which I will sort of touch on. So not a lot is known about the specifics of this game, though some information has been trickled out over the years. For starters, I believe this was going to be a prequel to the films featuring the ancestors of the titular dwarfs. I did read one Kotaku interview that said while this was still going to be a prequel, it would be more directly tied to the film itself, featuring the main antagonist being banished to the magic mirror, which, as we know, would have happened in the film itself. But no other sources I could find had this information, so I'm just going to take that bit with a grain of salt. However, we do know that the main character was not going to be any of the dwarfs, but a player character titled the Prince, though there is evidence to suggest that your character could be either male or female. And like I mentioned, this game was going to be dark. So the game opens with your character being awoken by strange and unsettling sounds, which they naturally investigate. This leads them to discover a shadow monster, which you, the player, will fight, and it's only after you defeat it in battle when it's revealed that the shadow monster was just an illusion, and the person you fought in battle was your mother. And that's how the game opens. From there, I couldn't find any actual plot details, but one confirmed piece of information was that while you couldn't actually play as the dwarves themselves, they would act as your companions in the story. They would be able to be used in battle, each having their own unique skills, but they could also be used in the overworld to help solve puzzles. So they would not only have their own strength in battle, but with puzzles as well. You would even be able to combine the skills of different dwarves to help you progress through the game. I have to say, I do find this really hard to judge because there is so little information out there and so much of it is secondhand. But honestly, I am inclined to prefer this take as opposed to the film idea. And I actually find myself wishing I could play it. For one, it seems so far removed from the original film that it's not really touching on anything and may as well be its own thing, outside of a few likely subtle nods. And yeah, I did have complaints about the dark tone of the film proposal, but I do find that this would be different. I am someone who likes to see Disney be more ambitious with its projects, and I do think that it has the ability to pull off darker tones really well. I just don't know if it works with established characters. One exception I will give is Mickey Mouse himself, because Mickey isn't really that much of a defined character, but more so a flexible mascot that can be taken in almost any direction. Of course, I'm referring to Epic Mickey, which there is art of a much darker game than what we got, even though that wasn't actually what the game was envisioned as being. It was just concept art to see how dark they could take it, but I can't divulge here. Side note, I'm recording this on January 2nd of 2024, so this statement itself has aged really well. And I like that this game was being developed for the Xbox 360 and PS3. You know, the real consoles at the time. And based on what we saw, this game likely was targeting an older demographic, which I want to hold on to for just a bit later in this video. One thing I did get conflicting reports on was just how dark this game was going to be. There is some information suggesting that Disney wanted a dark game and Obsidian delivered. But in a Eurogame interview, Obsidian co-founder Chris Parker claims that Disney wanted a dark game, but Obsidian delivered something a little more lighthearted than they envisioned. But what we do know is that it was being taken very seriously by the developer. Josh Sawyer, who would eventually direct New Vegas, was the combat lead, and Brian Mitsoda, who helped write for Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, was the creative lead. So this wasn't just going to be like your run-of-the-mill tie-in game that we saw all the time in this era. And yeah, I would have liked to play this purely based on the scant information we have. Sue me. And side note, I do find it very funny that the tie-in game for the Disney Dwarfs franchise was going to be this dark, epic console RPG, while the fairies got a light and colorful MMO where you can dress up your fairy. Which, let me be clear, is great. So everything seemed to be going incredibly on track, and this franchise was primed for success. So what went wrong?
Part 8. What went wrong?
A lot of things, actually. But it was a lot of separate, yet still interconnected factors that led to the axing of both the film and the video game projects. So let's go back to the film for a second. The team did have their grand vision for the film, crafting what would ultimately be a series. Subsequent films would have taken place after the original film, featuring the dwarves returning to their homes and reuniting with their loved ones. But as that initial film went further into production, more roadblocks made themselves known. Naturally, as is the case with any project being worked on from a company as big and labyrinthian as Disney, there are a lot of people with opinions and suggestions for the project. Things like asking if the film could be set thousands of years after the original film, or not featuring the Seven Dwarfs at all, instead starring all new original characters. But Disa did what he could to keep everything on track, more or less. However, one executive would bring up a request, one that would change the film forever. They asked if Dopey could talk. Yes, they wanted the famously mute Dopey to talk. Executives were hesitant at the idea of having a silent character having a lead role in the film, And mind you, this is also the same time that the Tinkerbell film famously had her talk for the first time ever. But while that could be explained by Tink only being able to be understood by other fairies, a feasible explanation had to be figured out as to why Dopey could talk, but later lost the ability to do so. And they decided on trauma, baby. The executives didn't want the film to be about how Dopey became mute, but did want it as a major part of his backstory. And they thought the best way to achieve that was to have Dopey witness his mother's death, which would traumatize him so much that it rendered him mute. After which he would go on a happy-go-lucky adventure with his pals. Yay! And sentiment around the film's dark tone began to shift as well. While executives were originally on board with its proposed dark tone, they later wanted it to be a fully lighter-toned film featuring more comedy and less drama, with the exception, of course, being Dopey's trauma. This revised version of the film was going to be pitched to John Lasseter with or without Disa, so he had to decide whether or not he wanted to be a part of this project. And ultimately, he made the decision to walk away. At the time, we also saw a major shift for Disney animation as a whole. One of then new CEO Bob Iger's first initiatives upon taking on the role was purchasing Pixar Animation, which Disney originally just had a partnership with. And as part of that deal, this man was brought into Disney proper and promptly took control of its internal animation division. Despite his tendency to harass women, he was incredibly well respected at the time and was seen as a sort of savior for the Disney animation department, which was going through a pretty rocky period in the early aughts. Yeah, I don't want to talk about John Lasseter, but I have to. So Lasseter was very vocally against the output from Disneytoon, specifically the sequels. He felt they cheapened the overall Disney brand, which good for him for taking a stand, I guess. Legend has it that after watching a rough copy of the Tinkerbell film, Lasseter called it virtually unwatchable. He also had Sharon Morrill moved out of Disneytoon. He's also responsible for the canceling of in-development sequels like Dumbo 2, The Aristocats 2, Chicken Little 2, etc. He also canceled a sequel to the god-awful Disney Princess Enchanted films, or whatever it's called. And the film was pitched without Disa present, but upon hearing this new pitch, Lasseter canceled it immediately. Yeah. And while not directly related to the events, at least I think, the cancellation of the video game also has to do with changing circumstances. So of course, all of this does have to do with Bob Iger taking the role of CEO in 2005. According to some who worked on the game, Iger and others considered Snow White to be an untouchable brand, and so no one would be able to put their own unique spin on it. And you can really sense a shift in Disney's creative output post-Iger. Nowadays, Disney is so hyper-focused on its brand and IP and sticking to the integrity of those brands and characters. There's next to no real deviation or experimentation when it comes to how a franchise is depicted by Disney, and even distinct films from the studio have all begun to feel a bit samey. And while yes, that initiative has led to unprecedented success for the company, that focus on brand integrity has caused a lot of things from the company to feel a bit sterile. But anyways, this caused Disney to axe the project after roughly a year of development, and all those factors combined caused the Disney Dwarfs franchise to fizzle out before it could even really get started.
Part 9. What now?
Despite getting really close to hitting the ground running, the Disney Dwarfs franchise never got the opportunity to be showcased to the public. And honestly, maybe it's for the best, because I can't imagine this specific franchise aging well for what I think should be obvious reasons. However, the Snow White franchise is still going strong, and of course Snow White is still an integral member of the princesses. And the dwarfs themselves are still popular characters as well. One of the most popular rides at Disney World is centered around the Seven Dwarfs and their mine. It even includes animatronics of them. Now, interestingly, there was an attempt to sort of modernize the Seven Dwarfs, but on television instead of film. In 2014, Disney XD, which if you don't know is a boy-targeted spinoff of Disney Channel, premiered the 7D. Which I think is somehow both a prequel but also an alternate universe take on the characters. Basically, the gist of the series is that the 7D, as they're referred to, live in the kingdom of Jollywood and are tasked with protecting it and its ruler, the air-headed Queen Delightful. And who are they protecting it from? Why, the evil Grim and Hildy Gloom, whom I hate terribly. They're so annoying. all they do is like kiss and make out with each other and talk about how much they love each other and how much they want to take over the kingdom. They're awful.
Diabolical dreamboat.
My gorgeous goblin.
My detestable darling.
My malevolent moonbeam.
My spooby wooby chum chum loopy doopsy whoopsie head.
I was not going to watch a 2-season series for this, plus it's not even on Disney Plus, but I did decide to watch like 2.5 episodes, and yeah, it's not for me. It's very much giving that LOL random style of humor a lot of children's shows of the 2010s had. Basically what people think Adventure Time or Steven Universe are without realizing that those shows do an incredible job of intricately building up its world and lore. Who knows, maybe the show does have an incredibly complex lore, but I'll never know. I won't give it a chance. For me, the humor was just so grating. It got really annoying really quick.
They make kissy noises?
I know, right?
Kissy noises?
I know, right?
Kissy noises?
I know, right?
And I also just do not like the character designs at all, especially those of the dwarfs themselves. Though I do appreciate the attempt to make them each visually distinct. I also do not enjoy the songs, which all just sound like songs that you'd hear on YouTube between the late 2000s and mid 2010s.
Whoa, at the end of the day, Grumpy needed a place to stay, but whose?
Which makes sense considering they were made by the Do You Like Waffles guy.
Do you like waffles? Yeah, we like waffles. Do you like pancakes? Yeah, we like pancakes. Do you like French toast? Yeah, we like French toast.
Essentially, outside of the use of hi-ho and the main characters themselves, this has no relation to the original film. And there's a magic mirror that's voiced by Whoopi Goldberg of all people.
When delightful's in command, you're the fairest in the land. Say hey!
I feel like I have to mention the upcoming live-action Snow White remake. I don't want to because that's a can of worms I don't want to open, but here we are. Anyway, there were initial reports saying the dwarves wouldn't be in the film and instead replaced by magical creatures of some sort, which came about after complaints lobbied by some figures in the dwarfism community. This of course caused major controversy, but then a promotional image was released showing that the dwarfs will in fact be in the film, but they'll be made with CGI.
In conclusion,
at the end of it all, I just find myself extremely confused about this would-be franchise, while also lamenting its loss to a degree. My biggest question is, who would it be for? Mind you, this franchise was envisioned as a counterpart to the Fairies franchise, which like I said earlier, has a slight overlap with the Princess line, but generally skewed younger. And if this franchise was meant to be targeted to boys around the same age, why do we have things like the dwarves not having a happy ending, or a video game literally involving the slaying of your own mother at your own hand? But what if this franchise wasn't meant to appeal to children at all? Something that jumped out to me while doing research on this is that I couldn't find any plans for toys. Only the film and the video game. I don't think it comes to any huge surprise that a major component of these younger skewing franchises is toy sales. Dolls continue to make up the bulk of the princess merchandise, and when the Fairies franchise was active, the same was true for that as well. But for older skewing franchises like the villains, it's not like we're seeing Maleficent dolls or anything. I mean, just, they sell those, but I don't think anyone would call the villains a toy-centric line. And because of that, it's not really seen as a younger skewing one. Much like how the dragon one sold legit collector statues and not like action figures of the dragons. Were toys being considered for this franchise? Probably. In fact, it seems very likely, but I do find it notable that in my research, not a single facet involving any sort of merch was mentioned, indicating it wasn't a major focus. And that, coupled with the fact that the media being made for this had a decidedly darker tone, makes me wonder if this was actually intended for a slightly older audience. Hear me out, this is purely conjecture by the way, but my theory is that this was in fact going to be a franchise aimed squarely at like 5 to 12-year-old boys. But with the progression of the film making it clear that this would be a darker tone, Disney decided to go all in. They knew they wanted a video game tie-in, so they decided to lean into that dark tone. And that makes sense when you consider that both the princesses and the fairies had some sort of video game tie-in. Perhaps Disney thought that this could be their key to the ever-elusive teenage boy demographic, which, you know, Disney has always had some difficulty trying to court, since a lot of teenage boys don't really buy Disney-branded toys or merch. And if, and I do mean if, that were true, It kind of makes me lament the franchise even more. Well, okay, not the franchise itself, but the specific output that would have resulted from it. While I do have my qualms about the film's weirdly dark tone, I do think it had the potential to be a paradigm shift in a lot of ways. Both in showing that disneytoon was capable of making high quality and narratively rich projects, and potentially changing opinion on the direct-to-video releases in general. While many quality films have been released direct-to-video, the medium in general does have a reputation of being comprised of cheap, low-quality cash-in films. But much like Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island revitalized the Scooby-Doo franchise, perhaps the Seven Dwarfs could have resulted in a disneytoon renaissance. You know, much like the Disney Renaissance. Not only getting new entries in this series, but maybe bold new takes on other established classics. And obviously the video game would have been really cool. I really like Obsidian as a developer, and I'm really intrigued to see their take on a Disney franchise like this. At the end of the day, this all feels like a relic from the bygone era of Disney, one that felt a bit scrappier and more open to experimentation. In this era, we got Kingdom Hearts, the first genuine horror-focused Disney Parks attraction, and more experimentation with the Disney animation output. Of course, this was also a much more financially rocky period for Disney as well, so there is that trade-off. But a lot of these projects are beloved nowadays. And I think part of it is because it's so different than what you would assume a Disney project could be. I do feel like if for whatever reason this franchise got a revival on Disney Plus, I don't think it would even remotely resemble what was originally envisioned. For one, Disneytoon Studios was shut down years ago. There's no way we'd get a singular story that ends in our hero's defeat. And I know what you're saying, Marvel did exactly that in Infinity War. But yeah, that's Marvel, the most successful franchise in the world. That was envisioned as part of the grand finale of the multi-year story that they wanted to tell that made billions of dollars for the company. I think it's a bit different. And it doesn't star fairy tale characters from Disney movies either. Also, technically that movie's rated PG-13. And the video game, of course, would have been rad as hell, but there's even less of a chance of that happening. Even though we have seen an uptick in Disney video games, those have a much more casual lean. Games like Disney Dreamlight Valley and Disney Speedstorm. And the more hardcore video games are reserved for IP like Marvel, Star Wars, and Indiana Jones, which, you know, already targets the audience that this potential franchise could have targeted. And speaking of which, that's another reason I don't see this franchise ever happening. Disney pretty famously has struggled to court a male-oriented audience, especially after the lightning in a bottle success of Pirates of the Caribbean, because, you know, they can't enjoy princesses and fairy tales. But they tried, with stuff like Tron, The Lone Ranger, The Prince of Persia, but then they bought Marvel and Star Wars, and that's all they needed. And it seems as though Disney itself has sort of soured on the idea of character-centric franchises outside the princesses. The fairies line is now dormant, and there haven't been any new attempts at similar franchises since. It's just stuff on specific IP, that's all. And that's kind of the story of Disney today. Lean in on all of its IP, as IP is what sells. It's a company that is so hyper-focused on brand awareness and brand integrity, which is lucrative, yes, but also sometimes comes at the cost of creative ambition. But that's the story of a proposed Disney franchise, one that was full of heart and ambition. But due to a variety of reasons, including corporate politics and a man who had to leave the company due to misconduct, it never saw the light of day. And that's kind of sad, but also indicative of how creative projects work in corporate America. You could pour tons of resources and love into something, only to have it never be seen by anyone, and there's really nothing you can do about it. Much like the proposed film, this video has a bit of a downer ending. Bye, like, comment, subscribe, and all that, I guess. I don't know. Call to action.
Kissy noises?
I know, right?